Hi, welcome to Reading or College Reading 2. This week, this video is going to continue our work on pre-reading. So, kind of catch you up from last week, we talked about how to pre-read and the importance of pre-reading. And if you can remember, pre-reading has to do with anything that you would do prior to reading and picking up a textbook reading. Those things include using the textbook features, which are there to help you get the most out of your textbooks. Those specific things might be taking a look at the intro or the learning objectives. Pre-reading involves reading headings and subheadings. Pre-reading involves checking out the questions that are at the end of the section. Pre-reading also includes looking at the pictures and the captions. And all of this is meant, all of these pre-reading things to look at, it's meant for you to activate your prior knowledge. And if you remember the way that the brain works when we read, your brain is organized like those file cabinets. And each file cabinet or each file in your brain corresponds to a specific topic. And so when you pick up a topic or a textbook article or a textbook reading and you know a little bit of something about that topic through pre-reading, your brain then goes and finds that particular file, pulls it out, and then any new information goes right into that file. It has something to stick to because a file had already been there. If you don't have a file, if you remember, this is a completely new topic, and for a lot of you, when you're in a class, the information is completely new because why else would you be taking that class, right? So you're learning all this new information, and what pre-reading does is it allows you to create a file. If you don't know anything about asthma, and by pre-reading you come across a couple of words that you've never heard of, but you encounter them during pre-reading, well, now all of a sudden you're starting to create that folder. So maybe there's a couple of vocab words, maybe there's a picture of the lungs, maybe there's the word inhaler, those kind of things. So you're creating this new folder that you've now been able to put stuff into. When you go back to read, those terms in that picture isn't going to be new to you anymore. And so hopefully the reading will begin to make sense. What we're going to continue with today kind of hinges on that idea of activating your prior knowledge. Anytime that you can activate what you already know about a topic, it's going to help you to comprehend that information even better. So the two things that we're going to talk about today are making connections and generating questions. And what we're going to look at first is making connections. And so you may have this handout in front of you, and I would encourage you to read this after this video is over. I'm going to hit the high points a little bit. When we make connections to something, and this first line is very important, it says that the process of reading is when a person reads the text and their inner voice makes connections between the words, their life, and their prior knowledge. And so reading is not a passive process. As much as we might like, we can't put a book on our head and have that information just seep into our brain. It doesn't work that way. Reading is a very active process, and so our brain has to be engaged. If it's not engaged, nothing's going to go in, and we're not going to understand anything. And so the idea behind this sentence is that you're having a conversation. The text is talking to you, essentially. Now, granted, it's an inner voice. It's not actually talking to you, but you should be making, some comments. There should be something going on in your brain as you're reading. That paragraph continues by saying the more closely the reader connects to the text, the higher the level of comprehension. And that probably makes a lot of sense, right? The more we know about a subject, the more we're going to understand when we read about that subject. At times, connecting is simple, but at others, especially when the text is not in an area that the reader has background knowledge, comprehension will be difficult. To be a better reader, think about how the story or the text relates to your life or to things that you've already learned in other classes or that you've watched on TV. And so how this connecting with text works. These are some things that you can do in order to connect with the text and to better comprehend it. I will also have a little disclaimer. These are things that it's written in a way that you might use these when you're encountering a piece of literature or a story or a novel, but they can work with textbooks as well. So here's what you should do. When you visualize, you might picture yourself in the story or in the text and think about how the setting and characters look. For nonfiction, for textbooks, you might, if they're describing a process, imagine what that looks like in your head. Focus on the characters. This works for history. So if you're in a history textbook or a science book and they're talking about scientists, compare them to yourself and the people that you know. So it doesn't have to be characters in a fictional story, but it could be. If you can put yourself into the story and think about how you would react or how you have reacted when you were in a similar situation. You know, again, I'm going to go back to that asthma topic. If you are reading about asthma and you have it yourself, you've got a front row seat. You know all about it and how you've reacted when you've had an asthma attack. Or if a sibling or a brother, which would be a sibling, or a parent or someone you know, put them in the story. Put them into the textbook piece that you're reading. Look at problems. So, you know, are they things that you've encountered in the past? Ask yourself questions as you read. We're going to continue with that in the next handout. And then when reading nonfiction, this is an important one. Think about ways that the information relates to what you already know. And if you need some assistance when you're reading through and you are having a hard time connecting, these are some sentence starters. This is similar to my life. This is different from my life. Something like this has happened to me. It reminds me of, it relates to me in some way. Or when I read, I felt ... Those are ways for you to make connections. There's also what we would call text-to-text types of connections, activating this prior knowledge. And this is when things remind you of other things. So this reminds me of another book or another TV show or a YouTube video or another class that I've taken. And they could be similarities or there could be differences. And maybe in one class, you talk about something in a psychology class, but then you also have talked about that in a history class. There might be some overlap, and those connections are great because you already have that information in your head. It could also be, again, movies, TV, things you read on the internet. All of those things can be connections that you can make. And again, the more connections you can make, the better the prior knowledge connection, and the more likely it is that you're going to comprehend that information. And then lastly, we have text-to-world connections. And these are where things connect in the real world. So things that are happening maybe on the news. Maybe it's not fictional, but maybe it's real world. And so, you know, things that you've experienced or that other people have experienced in the world. So again, I encourage you to take a look at this a little more closely. We're going to do an example of this. I'll kind of run through and we'll put the generating questions, which we're going to get to next, and also this making connections piece. We'll put that together. All right, so the next strategy that goes along with pre-reading and activating prior knowledge has to do with generating questions. And again, you'll see right away at the beginning of this, it's important to generate questions because essentially you're having a conversation with the text. If your brain is not engaged, I will say this again, if your brain is not engaged, if it's elsewhere, it's probably best to close the book and come back when you are able to give the text the full attention that it needs. I have been guilty many times where I'm reading along and all of a sudden I'm just reading words, but I'm thinking about what I need to do at home, what we're having for supper, that load of laundry that needs to be done. My kids need to be taken here, there, everywhere. And I need to go back and reread because I technically I read the words, but I didn't understand it. And so your brain always has to be engaged. It's an active process. And so generating questions is just having a conversation with the text. Now, when you generate questions, questions might be about a whole host of things. And in that paragraph, you see that the questions might be about things that confuse you. We've all come across those. Brain is engaged, but I read a sentence or a paragraph and I read it again and it just doesn't make sense. It could be because of the vocabulary. It could be because the concepts are new to me and I have no knowledge of these things. It could be because of the way that it's written in terms of sentence structure. And so those are kinds of things that you'll want to kind of keep track of. That's might be generating those kind of questions. I don't understand this. Help me out. And it's simple enough sometimes to just put a question mark in the margin. All right. And again, these questions about things that confuse you could be found in the text, or you might be asking questions that are not found in the text. You could also ask questions about things that you want to know more about, things that you wonder about the text, the author, things that you'd like to ask the author, and so they might be extensions that your instructor could give you. And so maybe that you're presented with something in the text, maybe asthma, for example. They tell you what it is, but they don't tell you how to fix it or how to treat it. And so when that happens, that's a question that you could go to your instructor and ask. It's a question that's not answered in the text, but it's things that you could ask your instructor for more information. All right, why do readers do it? It provides a purpose for your brain. We also talked about that last week in terms of using those pre-reading strategies. It provides with a purpose. We talked about what happens when you go to the grocery store with or without a list. If you go with a list, your brain has a purpose, knows exactly what it's looking for and what it needs. If you don't, no purpose, and it's much more disjointed, and you might get what you need and you might not. So generating questions is providing that very important purpose for your brain. Why am I reading this? What am I looking to learn? Once you know what those questions are, the brain is then able to focus on something as it reads, and it's looking for those. The second one we've hit on a lot already. It activates our prior knowledge. And again, that's very important in comprehension because it allows us to build those folders, provides a context, and allows that new knowledge to stick to what's already in our brain, what we already know. How do readers do it? Well, it's very simple. One way is to turn headings into questions that can be answered by the text. Those are who, what, where, when, why, and how questions. Questions can also be asked throughout the piece. So as you're going along and you come across a word you don't know, again, you can put a question mark in the margin. You can write questions on your textbook that you want to remember to ask your instructor later. And doing that is marking things on the margin is the subject of our lesson next week, but a great way to really gauge that you're thinking and that you're not just reading the words. Then there's some suggestions as to what a good question is, and I'm going to let you read a lot of these on your own, but there's basically a couple of things to remember. A good question obviously has to be related to the topic or the structure of the text. It's going to attempt to link what you already know to what you've previewed or to what you've read, and it's going to require that you read the text. So making a question and not having to go into the text to find the answer is a question you don't need to ask, right? Because our whole goal is to get information from the textbook by reading. And the sample questions, there are literal questions. Those are questions that can be answered directly by the text, and those are great to ask. And those might be when you turn that heading into a question, what is asthma? Now I have a purpose. My brain's going to read that. I'm going to search for the answer as I am reading that particular paragraph or that section. Inferential questions are those that you might ask your instructor. Why do we need to learn about asthma? Why is it so important? Those are inferential. They're not probably found in the text. Might be something you have to ask your instructor. And then these prior knowledge questions are those that get your brain thinking before you maybe even start reading, but also help you to make those connections. So what do I already know about X, Y, or Z? What does this word mean? Have I heard this word before? What do I hope to learn through this reading? And what do I know about how the text is organized? Meaning, is it a newspaper article, a textbook reading, a story like a novel, or a short story? So those are prior knowledge questions. All important questions to ask. I don't care that you know the type of question. I just want you to know that those are the types of questions that exist. All right. When we talk about the example, I'm going to go over and use this as our example to show you both making connections and generating questions. So I'll put both of those strategies together, which is what I want you to do for your homework. And this is part of the homework. Use your textbook to come up with questions. I'm going to add and connections that you have about your text when reading. You're going to mark these questions in the margins or in the or with post-it notes. I'm going to make this questions or connections in the textbook using post-it notes. And then we'll fill out a strategy sheet next week. What I want you to come with is a textbook that has writing in it that indicates questions and connections, or a bunch of post-it notes if you don't want to write in your textbook. Okay, so that's what you'll come with next week. Prove to me that you were thinking while reading. And let's just say, sometimes I know we want numbers, so let's say a minimum of 5 questions. 5 connections. If you have any questions, email.